Everyone mind now on Wuhan miasma. This Caribbean Rhythm episode 27 with Bronze Age pervert. But everyone now mind on this Wuhan China flu 1,000 point drop in stock market. Are you all stocking up on beef jerkies? Then the most ancient meat of all, which is the long pig or human meat of South Pacific tradition. I suggest in this regard you read Weston A. Price on traditional foodways. It's very interesting because the inland mountain tribes would often come to the coast on these Polynesian islands, and you see the flesh of the coast dwellers was seen as the most nutritious, and this probably because they had diet high in shellfish. Shellfish are food of power. Also, you could try fish raw. So that's why the flesh of these coastal dwellers was sought by their inland cousins. I could sit somewhere eating, one time I found 2-pound tub of ikra, this red salmon raw, eggs of the salmon, and I can just eat 2 pounds of this in one sitting. You put bread and butter, or you can eat sour cream and dill, which is filling for blina. You must make sure it's high quality, the salmon raw, because quality varies so much, and I think actually most people who taste this delight have never had a non-rancid variety of salmon raw. You can stock up on this. No, but for serious, if you want to stock up on something to prevent the Wuhan cold for you, I suggest, in Herodotus, there is a passage about the people who live on the steppe, and they live under cherry trees. I think he means sour cherry trees. And all they would eat are the cherries, the cherry juice, and kefir, which is the culture or clotted milk, which Tacitus also says the ancient Germans ate this clotted milk. It's very strange, this lactose tolerance story from HBD crowd. Actually, ancient steppe people seem to mostly eat only clotted milk or cultured milk. But so Herodotus says these ancient people from the steppe, they ate clotted milk in which they mixed the juice of the red sour cherries. And they also ground the peels of the cherries and they make a bread with it. And this all they ate. All their neighbors thought they were holy. Why do I tell you this? Because with these two elements, you can control entry of flu into your system, any kind. You can protect yourself. And what I mean is, the berry, you use elderberry for this, and for the milk part, you use colostrum. And I cannot describe to you what colostrum is, except to tell you is only source of immunoglobulins that you can get as a lay person. And so you can look up colostrum stocks, whether goat or cow colostrum, and you can use this to you can use it to protect yourself, to boost immune system along with elderberry, and be just like this ancient steppe people that Herodotus described. You can be just like them, yes. But then the other preoccupation behind the Wuhan flu is the election. Will Bernie or Bloomberg win? Look, I can't talk about this. This doesn't move me. Will it be the gay CIA agent, the stiff gay CIA agent, or the two all-Jewish guys screaming at each other? I cannot take this. Or maybe it will be Biden, the senile, token old white guy in the Dem coalition. If you could design a parody of Dem coalition, how could it be any worse? How could it be more of a parody? Well, you can add two screaming middle-aged peasant women with pantsuit and Adderall addiction. No one knows the way Dem primary will turn out. I don't know, but at this point, even Biden can make comeback. For example, he's very far ahead in South Carolina in the last poll I saw. So you cannot rule him out yet. Best poll, by the way, is Barris, I think, Richard Barris. On Twitter, you can look him up. He has the best polling company by far. But no one knows now. The polls are very strange. New York Jews apparently really dislike Bernie. Last poll I saw, Bloomberg is number one for them. Then butt joke, but Bernie Sanders comes in last. Why? You would not expect that, maybe. This really strange may seem. Why are New York Jews who aspire to American lisping fancy class culture, which is really office middleman culture, but don't tell them this, but why should they dislike Bernie? So I think the few right-wing old ones like Michael Savage, but there are very few of them, they don't like because they do have Bernie's number. They know he's this kind of a Marxified knish salesman. A crook, this type is. The Marxist professor with tuna-stained blazer. But for the rest, the vast majority, the ones who are aspiring to office culture, like I say, I think it's because he embodies too many of the ethnic stereotypes they consider parochial. And it's like the parochial persona they're trying to get away from. It reminds them of embarrassing uncle or other relative, even from stories they heard. And that's really a shame, because it's a shame somebody who acts like Bernie or Irving Kristol, this is the elder Kristol, who none of you know, and who acted basically like Bronx Jewish guy, and is charming in a way, is more genuine and likable. But that kind of ethnic shtick, it really makes assimilation aspiring Jews very uncomfortable. So then you get this kind of Bill Kristol and equivalent aping Harvey Mansfield manners and not the one he grew up with. But in the end, it's like, you put a tuxedo on a monkey and let it loose at dinner party, and what's the effect? Well, it's like that. And it's why Trump's act, this whole thing I'm telling you, why is secularized, assimilating ethnic is embarrassed of somebody like Bernie. And it's why Trump's act makes them also uncomfortable, too. That's the same thing, by the way, because Trump has the stand-up Jewish comedian persona in every way. He's adopted this. He's a showman, and some of the best memes about Trump are Trump as Rodney Dangerfield, crashing the high society party. Except today, there's no high society, just people impersonating high society. So in this way, the best thing ever written about Trump, by the way, about his cultural significance, is by my friend, the city bureaucrat. It's called Trump and the Return of Pre-Modern Incivility. This title of article, but I do not think you can find on Google search. So I will give you hyperlink. It's archive.is/JUY6X. Okay, so you can rewind if you want to hear. Archive.is/JUY6X. I must tell you, because it's a really amazing, best article ever written about Trump in press. I can't recommend this enough. It's a scandal that it's not widely read. It just blows away everything else written about Trump phenomenon. I cannot do it justice here, but it's full of examples, both from recent press on Trump think pieces and from history and sociology, and how Trump is very hard for the gatekeeping class to fight against. You all know this, because when they say he is a barbarian or a boor, they have problem, because they have a whole mythology of incivility as actually a positive and cool, rebellion as a good. So they have nothing really to fall back on when they demand others treat them with civility. They have no defense when they are treated with incivility. So I'll be right back to talk a little bit about this great article by City Bureaucrat, Civility, John Murray Cudahy, and the 2020 election. But in general, this show, the second half at least, is a quite experimental show, because I will be reading a lot directly from other book by other people, in particular Nietzsche, because I was fascinated this week by his idea of a male versus female genius of various peoples. Something that has concerned me over a long time. So I will read to you directly from Nietzsche and others on this show. I hope you enjoy. I'll be right back. Yes, you may have noticed I talk softer on this show. I experiment with new voice style. I think some people said that they had to go into psychiatric therapy because I was talking too powerful on previous shows. So I try for calmer voice this time. You tell me what you think. But I want to read for you one short paragraph from City Bureaucrat article. So I'm quoting City Bureaucrat here in his article, Trump and Return of Pre-Modern Incivility. But most of Trump's civility critics only inadvertently highlight Trump's debt to pre-modern incivility. Such commentators unconsciously recapitulate the agony Jewish intellectuals experienced when contemplating their less assimilated brethren in the shadow of a refined civil society. In so doing, they underscore the extent to which the crisis of Trumpian incivility resembles the socio-cultural crisis of Jewish modernization documented by Kaddafi. That's end quote. It sounds like a lot, but what means essentially the assimilated Jewish intellectuals or assimilated aspiring Jewish intellectuals were embarrassed by their less assimilated brethren. That's basically core of what I just said, and it's core of phenomenon you try to understand in this segment. Phenomenon that John Murray Kaddafi documents in his book Ordeal of Civility, which I discussed before, I think. But what this means, I spend this opening segment telling you and summarizing a little this idea so you can understand why Trump and to some extent Sanders, why they drive certain people really crazy. And I mean beyond the politics, they just drive them crazy because of their manner and because of what they represent culturally, what they remind certain people of, you see. So again, John Murray Kaddafi, Ordeal of Civility, I talked about before, his amazing book, but basically he talks about the difficulty many peoples, not just Jews, but many peoples had in assimilating to a culture of civility, the modern WASP culture in short, which is based on personal space, on individualism, and on the abandonment of collective identities, on self-forgetfulness and a distance between individuals, mediated by protocols of civility, which collective tribal or collective medieval identities, they cannot really accept these things. So if you ever met anyone from that world, you know, they budge in on people, they don't knock, they have absolutely no sense of privacy. And actually, this is an example Kaddafi himself gives when he talks about Freud and his patients. Because what is the argument of this book is intellectuals like Marx and Freud, that they really represent a kind of convoluted apologia for why Jews were not able to assimilate to this kind of impersonal WASP world based on civility and manners. It's really about the inability to fully embrace modernity and modern individualism and the codes of civility that go along with that. So, for example, in the case of Marx was essentially motivated by, how should I put, he was saying, you know, you Gentiles have all these stereotypes about the money-grubbing Jews and their dishonest financial practices. And he was probably embarrassed by many such medieval holdovers of the usurer type that had persisted to his time and probably still do to ours. But And this is the core of the Marxist apology project. His turn was to say, you too. That's the thing, that's the core of all these apology projects. You too, you Gentiles too. You have the whole of capitalism itself. It runs on similar kinds of exploitation that the Jewish usurer image is based on. So the whole Marxist economic history is based on this, on saying that you too, you are the same. Capitalism is exactly the same as the Jewish usurer, as the worst of that. And behind Freud is a similar motivation. This is all according to Kaddafi now. Freud's patients were basically all Jews who had entered the middle and upper middle classes, professional upper middle classes. They were granted political equality, but they had tremendous difficulty either achieving social equality, or when they did attempt this in fully to achieve social equality, they experienced enormous pain in having to abandon the ghetto mindset, you can say, the manners of the ghetto, the boorish, cramped, medieval collective identity they came from, where personal boundaries are never respected, where personal distance does not exist, where the individual is subsumed into a tribal way of life. So they needed a respite. They needed a break from the codes and mores of a Gentile society and its manners. The civility, the requirements of this civility weigh down on them. So in Freud's practice on the psychoanalysis couch is where they could take this break. They could just let go. They could let loose sort of the holdover of that tribal identity and express the great pain in having to bear this burden of modernity, of Gentile manners. So that Freud, this is from Kaddafi now, I'm quoting Freud's importunate course id. You know the concept of id now, right? Ego, superego, id. But Freud's importunate course id is modeled on the importunate yid from the ghetto or shtetl, the latent tribal dark identity, clamoring for admission to consciousness or to civil society, in other words. The id of the yid is hid under the lid of Western decorum, a wonderful short line from Kaddafi. So you see, the motion here is the same as in Marx, to say, oh, behind this whole charade of manners and primness and civility, with which you condemn our bad manners and, that we smell like garlic or whatnot, but you Gentiles, you too, are the same importunate, dark, covetous creatures, driven by base sexual urges. Behind your notions of a romantic love, you are actually driven by the same brutish drive, you see. So and so forth. So the story of Freudianism and the main claims it makes. But Kaddafi's anthropological genius is to show the origin of that in this project of tribal apology. And he also has similar things to say, by the way, about Claude Lévi-Strauss, the intellectual, and interprets also Leo Strauss in a similar way. But the Freud chapter is really the gem of the book, really a knockout chapter, because it includes what I consider a knockout evidence from Freud's own letters and such that makes this a very strong case. So I only summarize for you Kaddafi on this segment. You should read his book because it's much better than, let's say, the third-rate anti-Semite conspiracy stuff. It's very funny how the anti-Semites, they never want to go against Kaddafi. They only want to go against K-Mac or conspiracy thing. I don't know. Most Jewish comedians, if you talk to them, they agree Kaddafi was essentially correct. Because he's the real deal. He has the number, well, not just of this, but of other people's also, other ethnic groups that were unwilling to give up their group narcissism and to join modernity in this way, but that try instead to modulate modernity, to use its codes and mores against itself. The way you see, for example, Brahmin-class subcontinental Indian women, some of the most insufferable creatures, because they do this very aggressively. In India, they all have some kind of dark-skinned Dalit woman slave. Look up the Dalits in India, by the way. They have Negroid African facial features. It's amazing. And some of these Brahmin women, they look completely light-skinned, like Narendra Modi. You know, you saw him this week, but so they have this dark-skinned Dalit woman handle their chamber pots, and they wash their behind with a washcloth, and then they slap them on the face if they step out of line. But then they come to the West and they lecture middle-class whites about their colonialist culture of oppression. And it is in this way that you can understand the counterculture in general. Exactly this, what I just said now, that's what counterculture is. Even when the modern left or nice liberals reject the 1960s counterculture in its most extreme leftist political forms, they nevertheless strive hard to preserve the veneer of cool, the rebellion against uptight, stuffy, wasp civility that is the core of all counterculture, what I told you in the subcon woman example. So I cannot go into this article too much or all the examples City Bureaucrat gives from both leftist and right media. It's a very rich article in how Trump just drives the modern gatekeeping class absolutely crazy. Because he takes away from them the veneer of cool. He makes them into the humorless mannequins. So they have to twist themselves in all kinds of ways to try to, at the same time, denounce Trump as an uncouth, uncivil barbarian and outsider, and low class and so forth, and at the same time they try to reclaim for themselves the veneer of countercultural cool while they are the establishment. It's very difficult. I quote again from the article, this from a City Bureaucrat article now, I quote, "What is likely is that we'll continue to witness the slow self-immolation of the gatekeeping class as it struggles to recapture the social deference it believes it deserves, performing its outdated rituals of civility and select incivility in front of an audience that no longer cares. The death of comedy in the last decade is perhaps the perfect example. Indebted as it is to the Jewish experience of civility, American comedy is not well suited to expressing the viewpoints of groups and individuals protected by a ruling class that demands civility of its subjects. Sarah Silverman is an instructive case study," and so on and so forth. He continues to discuss case of Sarah Silverman, very, very interesting examples. But so it continues. So what I mean to tell you is that both Trump and Sanders represent, in America's psychology right now, it looks like this 2020 election. Well, look, I don't know. We'll see the way the Dem primary turns out, but it looks like the election will be 3 Jewish comedian archetypes from a generation ago, with, Trump being the most Jewish of them all. So what can this mean? Why? Can it get any stranger for America? And I hope in the end that Bernie does win the Dem primary, not only because America deserves a clear contest between nationalism and so-called socialism, but because in opposing Bernie, the national debate, I think, would be better from a nationalist point of view that I prefer, from national movement point of view, than if Trump had to oppose Bloomsberg or Butt Joke, who are themselves, by the way, the Butt Joke and this kind of half-and-half creep. That is, for example, Bloomsberg. Let me give you a counter-example. If Bloomsberg was a Fagin type, if he was the kind of a Jewish stereotype, kike type, as dark as it gets from imagination of Shtetl Yussoror, that type, he would have more of a chance to win than what he is now. This kind of charmless, flat delivery he has, in which he confuses for gentle manliness, but which to most people comes off as a slave driver from their worst corporate job nightmare, the boss from hell, without even a redemption of Romney's good looks. Romney came off the same way in 2012, it's why he lost, but at least he came off, he was a bit handsome. And Romney actually is also some kind of tribal weirdo, same shit. Condemns Americans for their ethno-nationalism, and then moves to Utah to get elected because, why? I don't know. Anyway, look, read City Bureaucrat article, is best sourced, smartest study on Trump, and I'll be right back. I am interested in peoples, in the true anthropology. And one part from Nietzsche book Beyond Good and Evil, Peoples and Fatherlands, this part, some aphorisms from there have always appealed to me, and this one struck me a long time ago about the manly versus female, the male versus female genius in some peoples. Not all peoples can be typified by this. But let me read directly because it's so good. So I quote Nietzsche now. There are two kinds of genius. One which above all breeds and desires to breed, and another which is happy to let itself be fertilized and to give birth. In just the same way, there are among peoples of genius those to whom the female problem of pregnancy and the secret task of shaping, maturing and perfecting have been assigned. The Greeks, for example, were a people of this kind, like the French. And there are others who have to fertilize and become the origin of new orders of life, like the Jews, the Romans, and, one could ask in all modesty, the Germans. People tormented and enchanted by unknown fevers and irresistibly driven outside themselves, in love with and lusting after foreign races, after those who let themselves be fertilized, and thus obsessed with mastery, like everything which has a knowledge of itself as full of procreative power, and thus, by the grace of God. These two types of genius seek each other out like man and woman, but they also misunderstand each other like man and woman. End quote. Oh, how this makes you feel, Nietzsche says this. Become the origin of new orders of life. What means? Amazing passage from Nietzsche regarding the manly type of genius of some peoples, but let me come back to that later in a later segment. So I think it's very interesting that here Nietzsche talks about the Greeks, who are his favorite, as a feminine type of genius, just like the French, who he also frequently talks about and much admired. Probably above the Germans, you could think. So as you can tell, this isn't really both types of genius that he mentions are complements, they're positive. And it is not the typifications of peoples into masculine and feminine as superior and inferior. They're complementary forms of genius. And I think I included the Japanese in my tweet declaring this episode among the manly types of genius, but is that so? I am not sure. I think maybe I made mistake in typing late at night, because I think the Japanese cultural genius is precisely that of the French and the Greeks, which is to adopt from others, to be fertilized by foreign ideas, and then to nurture and totally transform and perfect them into something different and majestic. I think at first sight you might think it's obvious Nietzsche prefers this type of female genius above the other, but it's only at first sight. But at first sight you can be forgiven for thinking so. You can see in many cases this is so. But not only in his estimation of the Greeks above the Romans, where he says that in the case of Rome, the energy of the people, it went into the stem instead of the flower. He says this in another place. Or in the way he frequently praises the French over the Germans. but also in the fact that he saw philosophical and artistic genius very often as a kind of spiritual hermaphrodite. He referred to himself in this way. He referred to himself as a pregnant white elephant. He say in Ecce Homo, his last book, that he was pregnant for 18 months with Zarathustra book, and that therefore the Buddhists would call him a female elephant. Why he says this? Because such a white elephant gave birth to the Buddha after 18 months gestation. You know, who was therefore a kind of elephant minotaur, please understand. So now then you see, in Visions of Human Genius, gestation of great visions and ideas, Nietzsche invokes some of the same imagery of female genius, of female procreative power to describe the philosophical and artistic genius. Camille Paglia, say one example when she talked how Goethe took his mother's cape and donned it on the ice, I think, in front of others one time at the ice skating park. What means? Well, you know, this imagery of the hermaphroditic nature of the prophet, or the seer, or the shaman is very old, this image. Of course, the gays and the trannies, they try to appropriate it for themselves and to say that this is somehow evidence that gays or whatnot were accepted in Siberia or Native American as tribes, as Native American tribes, as seers or as shamans. But this really neither here or there. The shamans cross-dressing, when it was not done to get sexual thrills. It was done for this ritual invocation. It had all cultic meaning, and I'm sure you can guess what this cultic meaning is. If you had to guess, that it has to do with incorporating or overcoming somehow the alien type generative gestation power of Earth. You know, like in the movie Alien, where I keep thinking of that xenomorph with the eggs, it frightens me. But the great Greek seer Tiresias is also said to have been turned into a woman for a while. And there are actually two stories about how Tiresias was blinded. The blind prophet, by the way, being another old image, but the two stories. One, that he saw snakes copulate, and seeing this terrible act, he was blinded. This is ancient Greek, prehistoric prophet now. He saw reptiles doing sex wars, and he went blind. And then second story about how he went blind is he was asked by Hera, Zeus' wife, which had the greater pleasure in sex wars? Was it man or woman? Since he had been both. And when he answered that it was woman, and therefore revealed the fuck crazy character of the femoid, Hera in anger blinded him, you see. So Paglia, I think, considers this second story to be cutesy and soap opera-like, and therefore as a baroque story of later origin than the snakes one, which sounds like chthonic prehistoric story, and she's probably right. But here my point is that this old image of the seer or the prophet, or now in Nietzsche terms the genius or artist, as being somehow cultically hermaphroditic or part female in psyche, is this very old image, very solid image. And of course, this is not a reflection on the low martial valor or the actual manliness of a particular people, since both the French and the Greeks were very high martial valor. They were in Nietzsche's list of female genius, but they were very much martial peoples, as are the Japanese. So you can hear Mishima in interview. He says, the Japanese, they love flower arrangements and this highly aesthetic, you could think almost, he doesn't say it, but it's almost female genius of aesthetic perfection, but it needs to explode sometimes in warrior spirit, and it gets tired of that. So what this typification of peoples is not like the English one into martial versus non-martial peoples. It refers only to highest spiritual registers of a people's cultural genius. It refers to the type of heights that the people may reach, whether it's male or female, and therefore this typification of peoples does not include all peoples. It doesn't even include the entire history of a people, because in its period of intellectual or spiritual decline or degeneration, a people will have neither kind of genius. And I must take a break and tell you about what happens when a people degenerates, what happens to its cultural life. So it's very interesting now to look at what Nietzsche considered happened to the Greeks, a people originally of high female-type genius, but what happened to them in their degeneration phase. And it's very interesting to consider here another passage where he actually compares the Greeks to the Americans and to the modern Europeans. And for this, you must read The Gay Science, section 356. How things will become ever more artistic in Europe, which is a really amazing section about meaning of the world for us, in any case. So it's a very important chapter. It's not that long, but I will not read all of it here, only part. So beginning I skip. He talk in beginning how in Middle Ages, in the world of guilds and ranks, that men basically saw themselves as predestined basically for their jobs. So if you were a smith or a shoe cobbler, you saw that as your vocation that you were predestined for. So he talks, Nietzsche continues, and I quote now, there are ages entirely the reverse of that I just described. The properly democratic ages in which people tend to become more and more oblivious of this belief, that you're predestined for your calling. And a sort of impudent conviction and quite contrary mode of viewing things comes to the front. The Athenian conviction, which is first observed in the epoch of Pericles, the American conviction of the present day, which wants also more and more to become a European conviction, whereby the individual is convinced that he can do almost anything, that he can play almost any role, whereby everyone makes experiments with himself, improvises, tries anew, tries with delight, whereby all nature ceases and becomes art. The Greeks, having adopted this artist creed, if you will, underwent step by step, as is well known, a curious transformation, not in every respect worthy of imitation. They became actual stage players. And as such, they enchanted, they conquered all the world, and at last even the conqueror of the world. For the Graeculus Histrio conquered Rome, and not Greek culture, as the naive are accustomed to say. So let me stop for a moment. Here is an important part where Nietzsche reminds you, Rome didn't really adopt Greek culture. It was charmed instead by the Greek actor, or little Greek actor, like he say here, Graeculus Histrio. And this also a very important hint to understand truth about Western identity, which is properly Roman in its origin and not Greek. But so let me return. So he say the Greeks actually became actors, and then he says something very relevant to modern world, modern America, modern Europe. He says, I continue with Nietzsche now, what I fear, however, and what is at present obvious, if we desire to perceive it, is that we modern men are quite on the same road already. And whenever a man begins to discover in what respect he plays a role and what extent he can be a stage player, he becomes a stage player. A new flora and fauna of men thereupon springs up, which cannot grow in more stable, more restricted eras, or is left at the bottom under the ban and suspicion of infamy. Thereupon, the most interesting and insane periods of history always make their appearance, in which stage players of all kinds, of stage players as real masters. Precisely thereby, another species of man is always more and more injured, and in the end made impossible. Above all, the great architects. The building power is now being paralyzed. The courage that makes plans for the distant future is disheartened. There begins to be a lack of organizing geniuses. Who is there who would now venture to undertake works for the completion of which millenniums would have to be reckoned upon? The fundamental belief is dying out, on the basis of which one could calculate, promise, and anticipate the future in one's plan and offer it as a sacrifice thereto, that in fact man has only value and significance insofar as he is a stone in a great building, for which purpose he has first of all to be solid. He has to be a stone, above all not a stage player. In short, alas, this fact will be hushed up for some considerable time to come. That which from henceforth will no longer be built and can no longer be built is a society in the old sense of the term. To build that structure, everything is lacking, above all the material. None of us are any longer material for a society. That is a truth for which the time has come. It seems to me a matter of indifference that meanwhile the most short-sighted, perhaps the most honest, and at any rate the noisiest species of men of the present day, our friends the socialists, they believe, hope, dream, and above all they scream and scribble almost the opposite. In fact, one already reads their watchword of the future: free society on all tables and walls. Free society? Indeed. Indeed. But you know, gentlemen, sure enough, whereof one builds it? Out of wooden iron. Out of the famous wooden iron. And it must not even be wooden. So he's saying, you know, the socialists are idiots, talking about building society in an age which is impossible to build any society, and talking about absurdity of free society. How much there is in one short chapter only of Nietzsche, you see. As much as in books and books by others. You get super distilled form of idea. He sees here entire fate of modern world of our time. The spiritual decline of democratic age, where everyone actually becomes an actor, unable to be material for grand project. And see also then, yes, the impossibility of socialism. I will talk about Nietzsche attack on socialism another time, because as you know, is not in the name of capitalism. It's not merely economic criticism of socialism that he makes. And in understanding spiritual incoherence of socialism, Nietzsche understands also its specific iteration in our time, where it's taken on the character of so-called gender or race or other upheaval. That is, he understands it as a code word for a militant decay, for biological warfare on behalf of a lower form of life, without a specifically economic meaning. But more on this another time. For now, you must notice how interesting Nietzsche say about the character of peoples, the Greeks, who he described as having a female pregnant genius at their height, capable of perfecting and maturing what they receive from others. But in a democratic age, they become merely a people of actors. And this tendency to merely an actor or stage player's existence, this whole spiritual orientation, make impossible the type of the architect, which is in its monumental form the great achievement of the Romans, the conquering and manly type of people above any other. There is some strange connection, I think you see, Nietzsche say, between architecture as art form And this manly type of genius embodied in some peoples that is capable of generating new orders of life, like he said, and of serving as foundation for edifice of millennia. But I must take break and return to this next. I've always been puzzled by that part of Nietzsche where he talk about manly genius of some peoples, and he say they are possessed by wild enthusiasms for others. He say people tormented and enchanted by unknown fevers and irresistibly driven outside themselves, in love with and lusting after foreign races, after those who let themselves be fertilized. Full of procreative power. What wonderful language, but what means? I've tried to see, he gives examples, and of course ancient Jews and Romans became origin of new orders of life, in ways by the way that the Greeks did not for others anyway, whatever you may have heard. Without Rome, we would not even know of Greece maybe, or Western civilization, unless it is a new beginning around the year 1000, like Spenglerians say. It comes from Rome, not Greece. But it was Rome and ancient Israel that formed new orders of life. So the third example Nietzsche gives is of the Germans. He asks, is it a possibility? But before I go on to talk about this subject, which is very important, I want to tell you a different view that you may have heard also about masculine and feminine peoples, male and female peoples. And you see this idea original in Gobineau, the thinker, father of steampunk racism, Gobineau. And in him, it is also, by the way, a term of distinction to be one of these two things, at least to be so in an intense enough way. His definition is, and I quote him now, I quote Gobineau, we may use here the Hindu symbolism and represent what I call the intellectual current by Prakriti, the female principle, and the material current by Purusha, the male principle. There is, of course, no blame or praise attaching to either of these phrases. They merely imply that the one principle is fertilized by the other. Further, we can see at some periods of a people's existence a strong oscillation between the two principles, one of which alternately prevails over the others. End quote. But basically, Gobineau means peoples are ruled either by the demands of the intellect, by imagination, by religion, and these are female, but those, on the other hand, concerned with material well-being are male. And he divides this into, well, at one extreme you can have the Hindus and the Tibetans, right? So they're the female character in the extreme for Gobineau. Because here in their nations, everything, all genius and effort goes into gigantic and beautiful temples. Nothing goes for the well-being of man. Everything goes into only the proliferation of religious cults, of high development of metaphysics, of both theology and philosophy of a sort. Literature and high lyric poetry all achieve high development. But then, he say, when you look beyond this to the demands of practical life in such nations, of useful inventions, well, they have no technology, really, no science or practical science, and none of the theoretical science on which technology could rest. And the power of observation of a real world does not exist either. And the Chinese, by contrast to, let's say, Tibetans or Hindus, they have a male character. So they are inventive, like the Romans and the Germans do, this according to Gobineau now, whereas the Greeks, they had a kind of a female character in the proliferation of their wild metaphysics, which is why the Romans exceeded them in useful inventions. And even he seems to say in positive science, useful practical science, which includes the great architecture and public works they had, and also the science of governing and of administration, according to Gobineau, by the way. So it is in this sense that he includes the Catalans, the people of Barcelona, and the Piedmontese alone. He says they are alone among the peoples currently in southern Europe as part of the male sphere of character, because they possess a male energy and inventiveness. And I think it seems to be true, at least when you look at economies of Catalonia and Piedmont even today, how advanced and industrial they are as part of their respective countries, and the stereotypes of... It didn't work when I put the tweet up about, and I said Catalans. Everyone told me, no, Catalans are gay, and this, it's possible. I don't know it's possible. But the vast part of the world, according to Gobineau, is populated by a kind of female or a sub-female inertia. And the Germanics, says Gobineau, remember now, he is a happy Latin Frenchman, you must remember. But he say that basically the character of Western civilization as it exists now is fundamentally Germanic, and that where the Germanic element does not exist, Western civilization does not exist. And I think he's basically right in this. And in his claim that Christianity and the other ideas, that the political ideas or principles are a kind of a veneer for Western states, but that it is the presence or absence of Germanic blood and its particular qualities that determines whether a nation has this kind of practical, energetic, scientific character that we know the West has, and which is shared in a lesser degree by the also male Chinese civilization. So here you see in Gobineau a view that is much closer to the neo-reaction view, maybe, or the human biodiversity, Steve Saylor, HBD chick view of things that is more concerned with IQ than I am, at least, but where there is the kind of distant spiritual kinship claim between Western Germanic civilization and the Chinese civilization. And this may be right in some way. But I want to read to you from Gobineau, but actually he puts it very well, this idea of male versus female genius of peoples. So he say, the conquerors of the 5th century, he means now the R1B conquerors of the Roman Empire, the Germanic conquerors. Are you listening, Scalas? Are you listening, Nassim Taleb? But he says, these 5th century conquerors brought into Europe a spirit of the same order as that of the Chinese, but with very different powers. It was equipped to a far greater extent with the feminine qualities, and united the two motive forces far more harmoniously. Wherever this branch of the human family was dominant, the utilitarian tendencies, though in a nobler form, are unmistakable. In England, North America, Holland, and Hanover, they override the other instincts of the people. It is the same in Belgium, and also in the north of France, where there is always a wonderfully quick comprehension of anything with a practical bearing. As we go further south, these tendencies become weaker. And he gives some example, end quote. And he gives some, Gobineau gives some examples here, including exceptions of the Catalans and so forth. But then he say, and this is a really strange and almost shocking thing Gobineau say, I must read for you. He say, our civilization has been created by the mingling of the Germanic tribes with the races of the ancient world. The union, that is to say, of preeminently male groups with races and fragments of races clinging to the decayed remnants of the ancient ideas. The richness, variety, and fertility of invention for which we honor our modern societies are the natural and more or less successful result of the maimed and disparate attempts, more or less successful result of the maimed and disparate elements which our Germanic ancestors instinctively knew how to use, temper, and disguise. End quote. To disguise. What does Gobineau mean by that? What did Aryan invaders know how to disguise? But so he continues, and listen to this end of Gobineau quote. He says, our own kind of culture has two general marks wherever it is to be found. It has been touched, however superficially, by the Germanic element, and it is Christian. This second characteristic, to repeat what I have already said, is more marked than the other, and leaps first to the eye because it is an outward feature of our modern state, a sort of varnish on its surface. But it is not absolutely essential, as many nations are Christian, and still more might become Christian, without forming a part of our circle of civilization. The first characteristic is, on the contrary, positive and decisive. Where the Germanic element has never penetrated, our special kind of civilization does not exist. End quote. How interesting to hear Gobineau says this. How interdesting. But please do try to disprove him if you can. I will say more on this when I return. So you know now what Nietzsche think of the actor. I return to Nietzsche now, I say before. But now you must hear what he think of opposite type of the architect. And to try to think why all the leftoids and liberal never-Trumpers chimped out when Trump suggested a return to architecture in the grand style. So I quote Nietzsche now. The architect represents neither a Dionysian nor an Apollonian state. Here it is the great act of will, the will that moves mountains, the frenzy of great will which aspires to art. The most powerful human beings have always inspired architects. The architect has always been under the spell of power. His buildings are supposed to render pride visible, and the victory over gravity, the will to power. Architecture is a kind of eloquence of power in forms, now persuading, even flattering, now only commanding. The highest feeling of power and sureness finds expression in the grand style, the power which no longer needs any proof, which spurns pleasing, which does not answer lightly, which feels no witness near, which lives oblivious of all opposition to it, which reposes within itself fatalistically a law among laws, that speaks of itself as a grand style. End quote. Yes, wonderful Nietzsche says this. Yes, the art form itself is connected to what in passage before, if you remember, where he talked about the architect as a type that designs the lasting and millennial edifice of a new order or a new civilization. Now, I don't mean to say Trump is this. Okay, Trump is just a great populist leader who heralds my coming. But in any case, you see the penchant, the turn of peoples in their far-looking phase, in their beginning of great vision. It is a characteristic turn to architecture as the preferred art form, as opposed to those civilizations that are in a democratic decay, which is where the actor, both as artist and as a psychological type, predominates. So that in another passage that I will not read for you, Nietzsche talks about the way that modern Jews have control over press. I think is Gay Science 361. And he say it is through their embodiment of the histrionic aspect, through their being actors as well. And he implies in this passage that the mastery of woman over modern democracy, the supremacy of Rostians, is also over woman's long natural shaping as actress, woman being the oldest dissimulator, the oldest natural actress. So the modern Jew becomes a kind of histrionic creature through the press, and as Europe becomes more feminine, in this negative sense of the word, a kind of lower sub-female quality, more democratic, more histrionic, Europe loses the ability to generate a new order of life for itself. It makes the opposite instincts, the architectural instincts in every way, it makes these decay. And society then becomes a playpen of narcissistic clowns. Well, I only wish we had real actors, but you know exactly what it's become. A carnival of insecure people seeking public approval, hungering for recognition, finally putting on the latest prefab identities in our own time, one after the other, in the hope of being noticed or validated, given public acclaim, anything. You get Instagram thoughts, that's just the least of it. TikTok trannies. So what you get is this great spiritual emptiness and lassitude that you might be tempted to call an overwhelming presence of the female element without the male. I'm working in Nietzsche conception now, not Gobineau. And that it leads to sterility. Except I think that even Nietzsche would say it isn't really the female element in the sense of female genius. Rather, it is the dried up husk of the ex-slut. So you might understand modern society at its so-called democratic peak as a roasty ex-slut hitting the wall and becoming a dried-up sterile femme cell. And that's character of modern society. Please watch some TikTok. And now by contrast, I want to read you something very different in closing, about what could have been, and maybe still what could be the alternative. So I do not chop up words with you. You know me, I tell you what I think. And I think destiny of modern world was to live under German mastery, and that feminine nations like the French, highly female, in the high genius of female sense. Female meant as compliment here, since most peoples again lack either the manly or the feminine genius. But female genius nations like the French would have acted as the incubators of the Teutonic genius. I believe this. And I believe also that the Teutonic new order of life would have been something much like what you see in prophets Goethe, Lichtenberg, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, which was leading to a kind of a biological awakening of intellect. Darwin is only the lower form of it. I mean to say that the new order founded on German genius would have been like the Roman and Israelite before it, a kind of a religion for the next millennium. And not just a religion, a kind of literally new order of life, new civilization, but one founded this time on consciousness of blood and breeding, or what you might call applied Darwin or eugenics. It would have thus been the final and true vision for mankind that would have taken human race already to the stars, or at least colonized solar system by now, at least. So Germany should have won World War I at the very least. This was stopped by a conspiracy of the lower orders of the spirit against the higher. You must understand. It is as if Rome or Israel had been stopped from putting forth the seed of their great millennial vision into the peoples, and as if darkness and inertia would reign on the world instead. But I think it is possible still for this new vision to be born in full and to hold sway in the West. And I remind you that Nietzsche say you only need 100 well-placed men to change civilization. But among my audience for this show alone, there are thousands, and thousands more outside. But I will close show now, since it is show Nietzsche, with another short passage from Master himself. So you remember how he talked above, about how Europe will become ever more artistic, and how the proliferation of the female, and in this case the degraded female form of the actor, will make the architect and all that implies impossible. But Nietzsche later has another aphorism to answer that one, how Europe will become ever more virile. And this aphorism I close show on. I read Nietzsche for you now, how Europe will become ever more virile. We owe it to Napoleon, and not at all to the French Revolution, which had in view of the fraternity of nations and the florid interchange of good graces among people generally. We owe to Napoleon that several warlike centuries, which have not had their like in past history, may now follow one another in short, that we have entered upon the classical age of war, war at the same time scientific and popular, on the grandest scale, as regards means, talents, and discipline, to which all coming millenniums will look back with envy and awe as a work of perfection. For the national movement out of which this martial glory springs is only the counter against Napoleon, and would not have existed without him. To him, consequently, one will one day be able to attribute the fact that man in Europe has again got the upper hand of the merchant and the Philistine. Man is once again triumphant over the merchant and the Philistine, over through the martial virtues promoted by Napoleon. Perhaps even of woman also, who has become pampered owing to Christianity and the extravagant spirit of the 18th century, and still more owing to modern ideas. Napoleon, who saw in modern ideas, and accordingly in civilization, something like a personal enemy, has by this hostility proved himself one of the greatest continuators of the Renaissance. He has brought to the surface a whole block of the ancient character, the decisive block perhaps, the block of granite. And who knows, but that this block of ancient character will in the end get the upper hand of the national movement, and will have to make itself, in a positive sense, the heir and continuator of Napoleon, who, as one knows, wanted one Europe, which was to be mistress of the world. Yes, end quotes, yes, this what I believe in. Nationalism as path to something quite different. The national movement as path, a return. This is the way to mistress of the world, authoritarian tropical beach empire. A return to the future. This, what I believe in.